Yes, thank you very much for inviting me. And I think without further ado, I'll just start. So from what I've seen from the internet, the previous talks in this series have focused on the intellectual side of the human mind. And since it seems clear that abstract thought cannot be instantiated in matter, this is indeed an obvious way of arguing for its absence in artificial intelligence. And at the same time, it is precisely abstract thought and its powers that artificial intelligence typically aims at replicating. Now, on those beings whose thoughts we know best and firsthand, namely ourselves, abstract thought itself rests on and presupposes operations of the mind that we share with animals. Moreover, both rational and non-rational animals are alive and therefore share features with plants as well, features without which abstract thought does not seem to occur in embodied reality. Rationality is itself a form of life, and in continuity with what prepares its operation within material reality from plant life upwards. If, therefore, computers not only lack the life of animals, but even that of plants, then there is much less reason to assume that they can have abstract thought, intelligence, or higher forms of consciousness. For if we cannot even make the life of a plant, why would we think that we could make higher forms of life that include abstract thought? And so in what follows, I will examine some of these features, assuming in this case the non-Cartesian view that animals have minds and plants are really alive. But the starting point is our own self-experience. As we have come to think of ourselves in materialistic terms, with our brains as carbon-based computers and so forth, it has become easier for us to think of computers as doing just the same thing that we do with our minds. And so the first step of the argument should be just to reawaken our awareness that this is a misconception about our very selves in the first place. And as we discover that we share then the relevant features of life and mind, even with plants and animals, but not with computers, we may plausibly conclude that not only we are more than computers, but even animals and even simple plants. And so I begin with animal minds, and with those features indeed that we share with them. Now, there are three features that John Searle enumerates for consciousness in general, and that would describe what we share with them. The first one are so-called qualia. The second is a unified field of consciousness. And the third is intentionality. And so these three we will be looking at in various permutations throughout. And none of these implies abstract thought. So I'm just going to bracket that whole question. But all of these imply the existence of a mind, and with it, a certain kind of immateriality. So to begin with qualia, number one. The first thing, qualia, may be the most discussed among analytical philosophers. These qualia concern the qualitative features of the mind that make it to be something it is like to have an experience. For example, the way red looks, or the rose smells, the way heat and cold feel, the way a clarinet sounds or coffee tastes, but also the way pain feels, with the consequence that we try to avoid inflicting pain even on animals, a concern that we not typically have in the case of computers. Such qualia cannot be reduced to something else, including something material. They are not mere appearances of other realities, because their very appearance just is what they are. For example, there's no such thing as a merely apparent pain. Apparent pain is real pain. Nor can such qualia be reduced to material states in the brain. If I see a flower, nothing in my brain turns blue. So that the blue flower does not translate into blue brain states. And this is not for a lack of proper microscopes that we do not see it in the brain. On no level of examination is there anything blue in the brain. If we open our skulls, all that we will find is the same old gray matter. And so with all the other qualia, as Thomas Nagel has argued repeatedly. And indeed, there is no need to argue this point here at length, because it is not only well known, but indeed of such anti-reductionist force that some, even like David Chalmers, feel forced to adopt a form of panpsychism in response, a point to which I will return. Hence, qualia imply a certain kind of immateriality, because they are real, yet invisible. Now, Thomists here will recall Aquinas' opinion that, unlike abstract thought, sensation is bound up with the materiality of its organs, eyes and ears and so forth. Aquinas also says, though, that the sensation itself is not corporeal, and notices that in our perception of blue, the pupil itself does not turn blue. And so Aquinas would agree with that observation. Secondly, we have the unified field of consciousness. What John Searle calls the unified field of consciousness may be less familiar from Aquinas, but more so from the thought of phenomenology. This means that we are always aware not just of one, but of many things, especially in the higher faculties of our mind. At the same time, all of these things are in the same mind, forming a unified field of consciousness in which some things are more in focus and others at the periphery, yet also present and in potency of becoming the center of attention. As such, they are unified in the mind, even where they are not unified in reality. For Thomas Aquinas, too, it is one of the perfections of the mind to unify all the perfections that are dispersed in the external world. Mind is a unifier, or perhaps one can say in a Kantian idiom, a synthesizer. The mind is one and therefore in some way unifies the many things that are its contents. Metaphysically speaking, higher degrees of unity are higher degrees of being. The mind is giving things a higher unity that they do not possess of themselves, is in some way a higher form of being that cannot be reduced to what it so unifies. The mind is irreducible to a material realm that is unified only in the mind, but not in itself. And this is also one of the many reasons why thought is superior to language and cannot be reduced to it. Language is a material tool for the communication of thought. Yet, not unlike computers, the materiality of language does not possess that thought intrinsically. For the ink marks or sound waves of a sentence do not intrinsically have the unity that propositions have in the judgment of the mind. The period at the end of the sentence does not constitute the unity of the material signifiers, except in our mind that reads it. And likewise, no such unified features appear in the brain that thinks such unified thoughts or has a unified field of perception. There are only individual neurons and their patterns of firing. And even in a simple case of sense perception, such as vision, there are only anatomically separate neurons that specialize then, for example, in the aspects of line, angle, and color. Now, all of these, how can they account for one single unified conscious visual experience? This unity comes from the mind and is irreducible. Now, thirdly, intentionality. The intentionality of the mind is irreducible to mere material states in the following way. The causality of material things, such as billiard balls, may bring about material effects in other things, such as when one billiard ball moves another one. The latter billiard ball, however, will not have an experience of the other billiard ball. It will not feel anything like pain by being bumped into, for example, nor have a sense perception of the other billiard ball as a result of its impact. As St. Thomas notes, if a mere physical alteration were sufficient for sensation, then all material bodies would sense something when they undergo change. Sensation is something over and above physical causality because it is a perception of the cause. And to perceive something that causally affects us means to move in a direction that is causally upstream. So if I see a blue flower, then the light waves affect my retina causally and trigger further causal events of the neurological sort. But to be aware of the flower moves in the opposite direction, towards the flower. And this movement is nothing physical. It bends the mind backwards towards the causal origin of its perceptions. It is what we call intentionality, a kind of directionality of the mind. Consciousness as such is always the consciousness of or about something, and this aboutness is nothing physical, for it moves in the opposite direction of the physical. Otherwise, we should be able to detect, with the help of sufficiently sophisticated machinery, whenever someone else is thinking about us. Intentionality in this sense is not just, as typically in English, a feature of practical intentions, but of the mind in general. It covers all the acts that have this kind of directionality. For example, the memory of something, the desire of something, thought of, choice of, love of, and so forth. Consciousness, therefore, is always the consciousness of something. And this explains why, when Buddhists aim at the consciousness of nothing, whether that is possible or not, they aim at a state that they call no mind. Abstract thought also has this feature, but it's important to recognize that the intentionality of the mind exists already on the level of non-rational animal minds, and such animal minds are essentially embodied. This is not only important for the mind, but also has repercussions for this body. It is the way in which the body becomes a living body, rather than a dead external tool, or something like a prosthetic limb. Thus, we do not experience tactile sensations in our brain, but in our fingers or other parts of our body, be it on the skin or by pressure on its internal organs. The awareness of is embodied in the very organs of our body. The intentionality of our mind colonizes our whole body and spreads over it like a blush, as Raymond Tallis says. Touching things is not just something that happens to us, as it does to a billiard ball or a sensor of a computer, nor is it something that occurs only in the brain, but it is something we do, and in our whole living body. In this way, our body comes alive and is filled with the spontaneity of a living intentionality. None of this we suspect in computers. Computers do not blush. They do not have a living body. Nor has it ever been claimed to be otherwise. Not even on this basic level can machines have consciousness as an embodiment of intentionality. At best, consciousness in computers would need to be like a Cartesian ghost in a machine. But the assumption that there is such a ghost is indeed a superstition without a basis in the observable bodies. Another feature of intentionality that is less readily perceived is that it opens up a space of negativity that does not exist in purely material phenomena. For example, the intentionality by which an animal searches for food implies that it has not found it yet. The food is still absent to the animal in the material world, yet it is present in the mind that searches for it. The mind that here is the presencing of an absence. Terence Deacon calls these the absential features, and he sees it as embedded in the biological functions more generally. This negativity can be found not only in the future-directed searching of the mind, as an animal searching for prey, but also in the past-directed mental activity of remembering. In remembering, my mind bestows a presence on an absent thing that is otherwise lost in the past. Such things are physically absent, but mentally present. Hence, memory cannot be something physical. In a material entity here and now, nothing absent is present. And so the memory of a computer, even though we talk that way, is a certain physically present configuration of the machine into which we read an absence by virtue of the intentionality of our mind. The computer remembers only in the interpretation of our mind. More generally, physical states are always something positive. Absence is not a physical state because it is the absence of something physical. What mere physical matter therefore lacks is negativity. Negativity only exists for the intentionality of a mind, and it is from our mind and its space of negativity that we can get to the thought of something positive, but not vice versa. So how so? we can negate the negation. And then, as we know from mathematics, a double minus makes a plus. On the other hand, mathematics also tells us that a double plus does not make for a minus. It's a thought from Robert Spaemann, which implies we never get from the physical to the mental, but only in the reverse. Mind is not reducible to matter, but mind can encompass the positivity of matter in its understanding of materiality. Neither the brain and its mere materiality, nor the electronic circuits of a computer will give us a mind with its intentionality and the space of negativity. Finally, intentionality also accounts for the meaning of our language. The meaning. To mean something is just another instance of intentionality. If I'm conscious of something, then I mean something. Mind is intrinsically meaningful. Our external language is meaningful only because it participates in mental meanings, and it does so by conventional agreement and interpretation, the latter themselves being mental activities. Language, as John Searle has insisted, does not have meaning intrinsically but conventionally. The meaning or information that language contains is something that is observer relative in the sense that it has this property only because our mind reads it into its material configurations. What is true for language is true for computers. There is literally no information in a computer other than a manner of speaking or an interpretation of our mind. Nor does the computer need a mind or information to do what it does. It can even translate a text with Google Translate or DeepL into a different language without any meaning or semantics being present in the machine and its materiality. The man in John Searle's Chinese room manipulates the signs of both languages without knowing either of them. Its ability to simulate a human translator not only remains dependent and parasitic on human capacity as a matter of fact, so all the data sets on which neural networks are continuously trained, but the simulation is also completely independent from the understanding of any mind, and to stipulate the existence of such a mind is completely arbitrary. A perfect simulation, even if it passes the Turing test, is still just that, a simulation, and it does not need to be more in order to do what it does. Hence, the assumption of machine consciousness is an arbitrary assumption, a superfluous ghost in the machine. But making the machine internal model of our own mind makes it even worse, for, as we have said, attributions of intentionality, meaning, memory, or information are all dependent on the interpretation of our mind that possesses these features literally, not derivatively as the computer. But one cannot explain the intelligible by something less intelligible, or use the derivative as the explanation of that on which it is parasitic. Now, these then are the three features that we find in animal minds, and so the implication is they're immaterial. Now, there is a complication that arises here, and it comes from Aristotelian ontology. These three features can be found also in Aristotelian ontology, so qualia, unified field of consciousness, and intentionality. These are precisely the features that have been banished from our ontology since the early modern age. And so we may ask then, how could such a reduced ontology be used in turn to explain them? What I mean is the following. Beginning with Descartes and other figures, what we have described as intentionality has been eliminated from the material world, namely the so-called final causes, the teleology in nature, and that henceforth appears only as a projection of our mind into the external world, form of primitive animism or superstition even. Likewise, the qualia. They are now John Locke's secondary qualities, which are mind relative, and therefore features that exist only as the mind's response to being affected by the quantities of certain wavelengths or of light or kinetic energy. But even the analog of the unified field of consciousness, namely the ontological and substantial unity of things, is eliminated with the rejection of formal causality. Moreover, together with the formal cause, things also lose their participation in universal kinds of things, The rejection is nominalist, either an inspiration or implication, and hence universal kinds are again also considered mere projections of the mind. So early modern thought sweeps out all these features from its ontology and says they're merely in the mind and otherwise projections. As exclusive features of the mind, the ontological equivalent is now considered to be a mere projection or hypostatization of the mind. Hence, any such feature is swept out of ontology and underneath the rug of the mind. One would expect that this cements a very stark dualism of mind and matter, rather than forms of reductionism. Yet reductionism is what we often find, an attempt to explain even the mind itself in terms of this reduced materialistic ontology. But as Edward Fazer noticed, this would be tantamount to trying to sweep the rug under the rug, an impossibility. The saner reaction would be to return to an Aristotelian ontology of formal and final causes and of real qualities in nature. Yet this then may seem also, with the return to Aristotle, a weakening of the case for the immateriality of the mind that we have made so far, as we now reintroduce mental features into the nature of corporeal things as well. But this is not really an objection. It would indeed ignore the immateriality of the features that we have pointed out before. Yes, qualia are real insofar as there's real color in things, and not just a secondary quality in our minds. But that is not the same as a perception of such qualia. The flower may be blue, but it has no perceptions of this blueness, as perhaps the panpsychist would like to suggest. And conversely, we may perceive blueness, but nothing in us, in our eyes or brains, turns blue, as we have said. Likewise, for an Aristotelian, a thing will have a formal cause of nature that inclines it to pursue certain purposes that characterize its final causality. But this will still be different from the conscious pursuit of intentions. Nor does the substantial unity of a thing imply that it has something like a unified field of consciousness. Just as being an entity of a specific kind will not, for the anti-nominalist, imply that the thing becomes a universal. Nor is being a dog the same as knowing the concept of dogness. All these features are in matter, but not as known, because knowledge correlates with immateriality. As such, immateriality allows the mind to assume and assimilate different forms as information. Now I'm turning to life, so sub-animal life. Life is not limited to rational and non-rational animals. Even we ourselves contain aspects of life that are merely vegetative, and they can exist all by themselves in plants. Now, not only animal life, but also plant life is more than the material entities that are machines. As just noted, the three features discussed above, qualia, unified field, and intentionality, have analogues in the material world without implying consciousness or mind. But they may imply life. To be sure, even non-living beings will have formal and final causes that unify them and give them a telos. But plant life, as an intermediary between mind and inorganic matter, has these three features in a particular way that makes it more than dead matter, be it in nature or in artifacts. And so I'm going through the three now yet again and trying to find a parallel in vegetative life. So first, the qualia again. What corresponds to qualia as mental phenomena, rather than just being of a certain quality, is the ability of plants to assimilate the outside world. Qualia as mental phenomena, we have said with Aquinas, presuppose corporeal organs, but occur in the mind in a non-corporeal mode, as Aquinas says, which is why we cannot perceive them in the brain. And this means that the mind must have assimilated these qualities to itself, that is, into its own immaterial mode. Now, plants do something analogous when they assimilate material substances for the purpose of nutrition. They do not make them immaterial, otherwise they would have a mind or know what they digest, but they do change food into what they are themselves by digestion, using fire or heat as a tool, according to Aristotle. Perhaps today we'll talk about enzymes here. The nutrients are henceforth no longer minerals or water, but flowers and pineapples and oak trees, in which these elements only persist in a virtual form. A major difference is that knowing takes on the form of a thing without its matter, whereas digestion takes in the matter and changes it into its own form. But both are forms of assimilation, and that's sort of the parallel I'm trying to make here. The assimilation that happens by metabolism is, for Aristotle, the most basic form of spontaneity or life. For life is spontaneity or self-motion. And the self-motion is not necessarily locomotion, for locomotion is found only in higher animals and presupposes a mind that allows animals to navigate their motions in space. By contrast, metabolism is a more fundamental kind of self-motion, which is shared by all life forms, including plants without mind and locomotion. In both physical and mental assimilation, the resulting growth in body and mind does not affect the identity of the growing entities, whereas additions to an inorganic aggregate may lead to a change in its very identity. This is why the replacement of parts of an organism by mechanical parts or computer chips will eventually kill it. That's at least what I would assume, unless it can integrate these parts into its very life, which seems rather unlikely, although we have things like dish brain now too. This assimilation by nutrition, so the metabolism that we talked about, can be contrasted in principle with both inorganic and mental forms of containment, and to which it therefore should also not be reduced. And this contrast can be articulated in forms of identity and difference. So the first case would be something that is contained in inorganic material, like the milk in the pot. Something that's contained in that way remains different from that by which it is contained, rather than becoming in some way identical with it. In this case, therefore, there's difference without identity. The milk remains different from the pot. They don't become identical in any form or shape. Secondly, assimilation by nutrition, as in the organic life of plants, consists in taking something in by transforming it. Hence, the plant does not just act like a physical container. Whatever is taken into the plant in this way becomes identical with the plant without retaining any difference. It is the reverse of the case of physical containment, namely identity without difference. In between, we may add here perhaps a chemical reaction. Chemical reactions, there's a continuity between two substances in which there's neither identity nor differences. Two substances change into something new, neither preserving their original difference nor their original identity. It's not a case of containment at all. So, but then finally, we have mental containment. Mental containment, by contrast with all of the above, is a case of identity in difference. For a mind can become what it knows, identify with it, while remaining different from it. Immateriality allows the thing contained in the mind to inform the mind without detriment to the identity of both. In fact, mind is only actual in becoming something else, without losing its own identity. The mind becomes itself insofar as it becomes another. It is what the scholastics call fieri aliud in quantum aliud. This is how we can then distinguish the case of filling milk into a pot from drinking milk and from knowing milk. While digesting and knowing should not be conflated, there's nevertheless a certain analogy, which is why we use metaphors such as food for thought, and perhaps finding some ideas indigestible. The analogy consists in the fact that both have a certain interior into which something is assimilated. In the case of a physical container, on the other hand, this is less obvious. The part of the pot that is filled by the milk may not even truly be part of the pot. will be external to it. Computers may not even have such a spatial interior and therefore do not constitute any case of containment at all. They are just a continuum of causal processes which do not meet any intrinsic boundary. Nor do they create new boundaries as in a chemical process that results in a new compound. Any boundary or unity of a machine is only the result of the unity of the purpose it has for us, and therefore is observer relative. Life, on the other hand, confronts us with a basic form of otherness or mind-independent unity. And this leads to the next feature of life, its intrinsic unity, so the equivalent to the unified field of consciousness. Living beings are not unified by cognition, let alone projection, but ontologically or substantially, that is, by their substantial form. Unlike the first feature of assimilation, or the third, that of intentionality, to be discussed later, this feature concerns not just what living beings do, but what they are. It is their first act, not their second act. For to be and to be one is convertible. If something is not truly one, then it does not even truly exist either. And if computers, unlike organisms, lack an intrinsic unity, then they lack existence as well. Without this kind of unity, a thing would not be intrinsically distinct from its environment, and therefore lack a sufficient principle of identity, as Leibniz pointed out against Descartes' all too homogeneous res extensa. Leibniz therefore insisted on reintroducing a notion of substantial form. But because he still presupposed with Descartes that the notion that unity and mind are coextensive. And therefore, Leibniz's monadology is a form of panpsychism. So to introduce unity, he introduced everything must be a mind. But this is not necessary if mental unity has a physical preparation in the unity of living organisms, beginning with that of plants. Leibniz correctly saw that unity can only be swept out of the ontology of matter to the detriment of its very existence. But as a result, he swept matter out of this ontology altogether. And that is not necessary and still proposes a reductionist understanding of materiality, one that doesn't include life. Computers and other tools and artifacts, on the other hand, do lack such intrinsic unity and being. As noted earlier, they are unified only by their purpose for us, and without intrinsic boundary to an environment. Nothing can enter into them in order to be contained or assimilated or known. So this is a consequence. And this is moreover the reason why computers also cannot die, because they're not alive. We do not kill them if we shut them down in the evening. Now, with the help of AI, we now do make artificial animals, such as robot dogs, for the entertainment of children and the elderly. We do that because they are less messy. They do not need to be fed or walked, and they do not leave the results of their digestion somewhere. And if at the end of the day, we do not want to be bothered, we just shut them down. Tomorrow, we will turn them on again. But we cannot do this with real dogs. And hopefully people will not grow accustomed to treating living animals accordingly. The dog is real because the dog is alive. Shutting it down would mean that we kill it. And the difference from the AI dog is that we cannot turn it on again. And the reason why we cannot turn it on again is that its substantial form, its soul, has left, and we have no power to give it back. We have deprived it of its first act and have no power to resurrect it. Its principle of being is its principle of unity. The dog begins to decompose, and we cannot put Humpty Dumpty back together. And the reason is not that it is too complicated of a problem, but rather that it is too simple. It is the simplicity of a unifying form, the principle of unity that animates living beings, including plants, which is outside of our power. But if that is true, then we should not be surprised that we have never been able to make life, and that all life comes from other life, omne vivum ex vivo, And if we are not able to make life, why would we think that we can make conscious life, which is a higher form of life? All we can do is to simulate the behavior and functioning of dogs and other living beings. To simulate their life would mean to simulate their being, because for living beings, to live is the same thing as to be. Vivere viventibus est esse, as Aquinas says. Hence, a simulation of life would need to be more than a simulation, namely the real thing. If we could do that, then we also could resurrect the dog. To turn a computer on and off, on the other hand, is not the same as killing and generating life, and much less is required for achieving it. Now, the third and final feature is intentionality. Intentionality in living beings. Intentionality, we said, is the aboutness of the mind with regard to its various intentional objects. The mind aims at its objects in various cognitive and practical ways. Its objects define the conditions of satisfaction, terminology of John Searle, under which our mind would become settled in its attempts to know or change the world. In other words, intentionality is a teleological notion. The faculties of our mind are teleological powers. They intrinsically aim at something relative to which we can speak of success or mistakes. As they have said earlier, this is not the case for machines, who have no purpose except that which our mind gives them. Their purposivity or teleology is parasitic on our minds. But in the case of life, we do speak of purposivity. Any talk of biological function is teleological talk, a point on which Terence Deacon has insisted. Relative to a function, we can then speak of misfirings, of failed developments in plant life. Failures in genetic coding, for example, can lead to failures in the development of the plant. But these are not failures in the physical world and mere physical world and the causalities described by the laws of nature. These will always follow the laws of nature without fail. It is a failure relative to the telos of the organism and the forms that its life aims at. Aiming at a norm or final cause is something intrinsic to the plant. It is not just our projection on plants, perhaps out of agricultural interests, nor is it parasitic on our mind. For plants existed long before Homo sapiens. It is the equivalent to intentionality in plants, though in a non-mental way. It too aims at something that is not yet. It too, therefore, introduces a sense of absence and negativity in the sense of a potency that aims at its actualization. Likewise, it introduces a certain form of self-transcendence, as Thomas Aquinas notes. Unlike matter, which is just what it is, life intrinsically aims beyond itself. St. Thomas argues that though it is different from mind in doing this by virtue of a corporeal reality, yet it proceeds from an intrinsic principle that moves itself and uses other things as its instruments, such as heat and digestion. None of this exists in corporeal things without a soul. Now, unlike sensation, which aims at all bodies, and reason, which aims at all beings, Aquinas says, vegetative powers have a telos that aims not beyond the plant body, but only at this very body itself. The powers have the effect where they exist, not in another. This object and the corresponding powers are twofold: nutrition, by which the body is preserved in its existence, and augmentation, by which it grows. Growth presupposes existence and is its further actualization or telos. Together, nutrition and augmentation have yet one further telos, namely that any perfect being has, which is to produce its like in another. And that is generation or procreation. Generation or procreation transcends now the body even of the vegetative life. So that's one case where it goes beyond its own body and aims at another being of its own kind. And the cycle continues from there, because generation then is the beginning of another existence, which, Thomas Aquinas says, must by necessity start small, and therefore requires the power of growth, which eventually leads to the next generation. But generation is the perfection of this cycle, and it is where even vegetable life transcends itself towards another. And all of that cannot be found in the inorganic world. Moreover, power of growth is required because animal life starts small, as we just said. And the reason for that smallness, Aquinas says, points us to another feature of living beings, namely that they do not come from mechanical causes and processes, but from a seed that is itself a bearer of life and an eternal prefiguration of another being of its own kind. Now, we may, of course, try to replicate this by having a robot reproducing itself by a 3D printer. But the comparison would break down once we notice that, unlike in living beings, this is not a required process. Human making or assembly lines will do the same for robots, whereas all life must come from another living being of its kind, omne vivum ex vivo, and that is by a seed. One should also note that the self-replicating 3D printer, unlike an animal or plant, would not produce a being that is still in need of growth. In this, the robot replication would would resemble not generation, but the human making of artifacts. Or else it would be like divine generation, or Athena coming from the head of Zeus. The robot not only does not need growth, but it is also incapable of it. For what could it possibly mean for have a machine grow in the way that a plant does? Now, the perfection of procreation, that procreation is the beginning of something that, in the great chain of beings, finds its perfection in the human rational mind and ultimately even in God. For biological procreation is the lower material form of what can be found in thought. For we say that we conceive a thought, and that thought is a concept. God himself conceives a thought or word, a logos, and that is why he is called a father. And the one whom he so conceives is called the Son. Thinking is generative of an intentional object, and something analogous can be found in all life, from an asparagus to the Trinity. The difference is, as Aquinas points out, that the product of generation is external in animals, but increasingly internal in higher forms of life, including the Trinity. Whereas in the inorganic causal continuum that can be found also in computers, where cause and effect remain completely external to each other, plants at least begin to have their cause in themselves, even if not the effect, namely the cause of a seed. All of this having been said, there are natural substances also in the inorganic world. They have their own nature that inclines them to certain kinds of behavior in the manner of a final cause. Nature does not like leaps, and there are always continuities. Still, there are differences. For example, there is no metabolism in the inorganic world, and the reason is that there is no kind of interiority that we find in plants that makes sense of a notion of assimilation. This interiority in turn requires boundaries in reality that do not seem to exist in the inorganic world, except perhaps on the atomic or molecular level. And that is why we can divide inorganic materials without killing them. And likewise, we can take a computer apart without committing murder. Computers, like inorganic materials, behave more like aggregates than like organisms. In conclusion, if we can make none of these things, why would we think we can make minds or even rational agents? These higher forms of life seem to presuppose the lower forms of life. That is at least what we observe in ourselves and in non-rational animals. Life is not just an odd detour that evolution has taken to get to Homo sapiens. Rather, it is a path that we ourselves need to take as well if we were to make any kind of rational living human beings by our artificial making. The reason appears to be that inorganic matter, the Cartesian res extensa or other reductionist ontologies, is too far away from mind and reason to be an adequate habitat. Living beings, on the other hand, have a unity and interiority that unfolds in the central nervous system of animals, corresponding to an interiority that is not a place of physical or spatial containment anymore, but transcending materiality. Likewise, self-motion, beginning with metabolism, prepares an environment in which even our free will is not faced with the interaction problems of a ghost and a machine, but can find an anticipation of its own spontaneity rather than being faced with a deterministic mechanism. It is this life also, in this life also, we find an assimilation of things which finds its fulfillment in the light of consciousness, such that it can even be understood as a participation in the divine light, in the life of one who has said, of whom it is said that he came to be, from whom it is said, what came to be through him was life. And this life was the light of the human race. Thank you very much.